The night my mother-in-law destroyed my daughter, she was wearing a $4,000 cashmere wrap and a smile that could have sold life insurance. My name is Anna Beaumont, and I have to warn you right now, this story does not start with me screaming or throwing things or falling apart the way women in these situations are expected to fall apart. This story starts with me sitting very still at a mahogany dining table in River Oaks, Houston, Texas, surrounded by some of the wealthiest, most socially connected people I have ever met in my life, watching my 19-year-old daughter's face go the color of old paper, while the woman who was supposed to be her grandmother looked her dead in the eyes and ended her. I stayed still because I was calculating, because the Beaumont family had spent 12 years teaching me, whether they meant to or not, that the most dangerous moves are the ones nobody sees coming. And what was about to happen in that dining room was going to require the most dangerous move of my life. What I did not know yet, what I couldn't have known, sitting there gripping the stem of my wine glass hard enough to leave a mark, was that by the following morning, the family's own attorney would be calling me in a breathless, barely controlled panic, and the secret he was about to reveal would change not just the course of my revenge, but the entire foundation of everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my daughter, and the family I had been trying to belong to for over a decade. Let me take you back 3 weeks, because nothing that happened at Thanksgiving appeared from nowhere, even though they wanted it to look that way. The Beaumonts were meticulous people, old Houston oil money, the kind of wealth that has had several generations to smooth its rough edges and replace them with monogrammed linen and a carefully curated reputation for generosity. My mother-in-law, Constance Beaumont, was 73 years old and ran her family with the same boardroom precision she had used when she sat on the boards of 4 different Houston institutions simultaneously. My husband, Tate Beaumont, was her eldest son, handsome in the faded, distinguished way of men who were very good-looking at 25 and never quite recovered from being told so, and he had been raised to understand that Constance's approval was the only currency that mattered. I had been raised in Corpus Christi by a nurse and a high school basketball coach, which in the Beaumont household translated roughly to charming but not quite. I had my own career. I was a licensed architect, ran my own small firm on the west side of Houston, and I had made the mistake, early in my marriage, of believing that competence was a substitute for pedigree. 12 years later, I knew better. But knowing better and knowing what to do about it are 2 completely different things. My daughter, Nora, was 19. She was home from her sophomore year at Rice University, 12 minutes from our house, close enough that she came home for dinner twice a week and still kept most of her clothes in her childhood bedroom. Nora was brilliant and funny and reckless in the specific way of young women who are smart enough to see the whole board, but still young enough to believe that being right will protect them. She looked like me, dark hair, wide-set brown eyes, my mother's nose, and I think that was always part of the problem, though I only understood the full dimensions of that problem after the attorney called. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, I found a note in my husband's coat pocket, 12 words, and those 12 words were the beginning of everything. It wasn't a dramatic note, no declarations, no purple prose, no evidence of the kind of affair you see in movies. It was a folded piece of notepaper, the heavy cream stock that Constance kept in every room of her River Oaks estate, and it said in Constance's unmistakable handwriting, the timing must be before the holiday, permanent, no room for appeal. I stood in our mudroom holding my husband's dry-cleaned jacket and reading those words 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, the way you reread something when your brain refuses to process the first 4 readings. I put the note back, I hung up the jacket, I went to the kitchen and made dinner, and I did not say a single word to Tate, who came downstairs at 6:30 and ate the pasta I'd made and talked about a work deal for 20 minutes and never once looked at me long enough to notice that the woman across the table had just started a war inside her own head. I spent the next 3 weeks watching. I had always been observant. It's a requirement of architecture, that ability to read space, to notice what's load-bearing and what's decorative, to understand how a structure holds together and where its points of failure are. I turned that skill on my own family, and what I saw made my stomach hurt in ways I pushed down because I needed to stay functional. Tate was on the phone with Constance more than usual, going quiet when I entered rooms and resuming the call in a lower register when I'd passed. Constance's younger son, Bruley Beaumont, was arrogant and impulsive, the kind of man who thinks power is a substitute for competence, and he was now avoiding me entirely. Everett and his wife Priya had visited the estate twice in the 3 weeks prior to Thanksgiving, which was unusual because Everett and Priya lived in Dallas and typically reserved their Houston trips for the major holidays. Constance's personal assistant, a young woman named Blythe who had worked for her for 4 years and who I had always liked because she was one of the few people in that orbit who spoke to me like a human being, had stopped making eye contact with me at the charity luncheon I'd attended at Constance's club in early November. And Nora, oblivious and studying for midterms, was making her usual Thanksgiving plans, asking me what to wear, whether we were doing the crab dip as an appetizer again, whether she could bring her roommate. She could not bring her roommate. Something told me she could not bring her roommate. I told Nora I'd check with Constance about head count, and then I quietly did not check, because I did not want to give anyone advance warning that I was paying attention. If they knew I was watching, they would have changed the play, and I needed to see the whole play. Thanksgiving at Constance Beaumont's River Oaks estate was the kind of holiday that required advance preparation, the way military operations require advance preparation. The house was 6,000 square feet of immaculate federal style. White columns, manicured grounds, a formal dining room that sat 20 and usually seated 15 for the holiday. There was always a florist, always a caterer from the firm Constance had used for 30 years, always the same bone china and sterling silver flatware that had come from Constance's own mother, and which Constance mentioned every year without fail as a reminder that some things in this family were older and more permanent than any individual currently sitting at the table. I had always found that reminder mildly threatening. This year I found it openly menacing. We arrived at 1. Nora drove herself because she was 19 and independent, and I had learned years ago that fighting the small battles was a waste of energy you needed for the big ones. She pulled in right behind us in the little Honda I'd bought her for graduation, wearing a burnt orange midi dress and boots, carrying a bottle of wine she'd picked out herself as a hostess gift, looking like exactly what she was, a confident young woman who had no idea she was walking into an ambush. I watched her hug her Uncle Everett in the foyer and laugh at something he said, and Everett laughed back and hugged her again, and I thought, does he know? Is this performance? And I filed it and kept moving. Constance greeted us at the door in the cashmere wrap, caramel-colored, impossibly soft-looking, and she kissed my cheek and said, "Anna, you look rested," which in Constance's vocabulary meant I looked like I made less effort than usual. She held Nora by the shoulders and looked at her for a beat too long and said, "My goodness, you look just like your mother," and smiled the smile and moved on, and the prickling along the back of my neck went from a simmer to a steady rolling boil. By the time we sat down to dinner, I was 90% sure something was going to happen. I was not prepared for how bad the something would be. The meal was flawless, the way Constance's meals were always flawless, because perfection was her shield and her statement and her threat all at once. We were 15 people, Tate and me, Nora, Everett and Priya and their 2 teenage boys, Constance's lifelong friend Margot and her husband, 2 of Constance's cousins who came in from San Antonio every year, and Bart Gallagher, the Beaumont family attorney, who attended family gatherings because Constance liked having institutional memory in the room, and because a lawyer at a holiday dinner sends a message that most people don't consciously decode, but everyone subconsciously receives. I had decoded it tonight. I watched Bart Gallagher move through the cocktail hour with the deliberate, measured quality of a man who knows something uncomfortable is coming and has made peace with his role in it, but not with his conscience about that role, which is a very specific posture that is hard to fake if you know what you're looking for. I knew what I was looking for, so I watched Bart Gallagher all through the cocktail hour and all through the first two courses, and what I saw was a man drinking more than he usually did and laughing slightly too hard at things that weren't quite that funny and checking his watch 3 times before the main course was cleared. I cataloged it all. I kept my face pleasant and my conversation light, and I ate the food. And I watched Nora across the table, who was talking animatedly to Priya about her urban planning coursework, completely alive, completely unguarded, completely unaware. The dessert plates were cleared. Constance set down her crystal champagne flute with the decisive click of someone calling a meeting to order. The table went quiet in the Pavlovian way that tables go quiet when Constance Beaumont signals she is about to speak. "Before we move to the sitting room," she said, her voice carrying the even, unhurried authority of a woman who has never once needed to ask for a room's attention, "there is a family matter I want to address while everyone is together." She turned her head and looked at Nora. Not at me, not at Tate, at Nora, who had set down her coffee cup and was looking back at her grandmother with the open, puzzled expression of someone who does not yet understand that they are the subject of the sentence. "Nora, sweetheart," Constance said, "this family has had some very difficult conversations over the past several weeks, and we have reached a unanimous decision." She paused, a performer's pause, deliberate, calibrated. "You are no longer considered a member of this family. We'd like you to collect your things and leave the property this evening." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't just fill a room, it consumes it. I heard Priya inhale sharply. I heard one of Everett's boys shift in his chair. I did not hear my husband say a single word, which was, in that moment, the loudest sound in the room. Nora sat perfectly still, and I watched the color leave her face the way color leaves things when something permanent has happened to them, and she said, very quietly, "I'm sorry, what?" And Constance said, "You heard me, baby," with the soft lethality of a woman who has had a lifetime to perfect the art of cruelty in the vocabulary of endearment. My daughter asked what she had done, and Constance said, "That's not really the point anymore, is it?" I stood up. I am not going to dress it up or claim I was strategic in that moment, because I was not. I was a mother whose child had just been publicly gutted at a dinner table, and every calculation I had been running for 3 weeks went completely offline. I stood up and I said, "Constance, you will absolutely not." And Tate's hand came down on my forearm, and he said quietly, firmly, "Anna, don't." And I looked at my husband, and I saw it. Not confusion, not surprise, not the expression of a man blindsided by his mother's behavior. I saw the expression of a man who had known this was coming and had decided somewhere along the line that the easier thing to do was let it happen. That was the moment. Not the dinner table, not Constance's words. That look on my husband's face was the moment my marriage became a past tense thing. I sat back down, not because he told me to, because I needed to stay in the room, and I could not stay in the room if I was being escorted out of it. Everett walked Nora out, not Tate. Everett, with the guilty efficiency of a man executing a plan he didn't design and isn't proud of, walked my daughter through that formal dining room, through that marble foyer, out the front door of her grandmother's 6,000-square-foot River Oaks estate, and into the November dark. Nora's car was boxed in by 4 other vehicles. I texted her the moment I could get my phone out without being watched. "Don't go anywhere. I'm coming. I love you." She texted back, "Okay." One word, the texted equivalent of someone holding themselves together with their hands. I thought about my daughter sitting alone in that little Honda, in her burnt orange dress and her boots, with the wine bottle she'd brought as a hostess gift probably still on the foyer table, and something in my chest hardened into something I did not have a name for, but which I recognized instinctively as dangerous. Constance watched me across the table. "There are things in this family you haven't been told," she said, with the composure of a woman delivering news rather than dropping a bomb. "When you know them, you'll understand tonight was necessary." I said, "I will never understand tonight." She held my gaze without blinking and said, "You will," and moved to the sitting room, and the family moved with her the way families move with matriarchs, reflexively, gravitationally, without choosing to. I sat at that table alone for 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes, I made every decision that mattered. Bart Gallagher did not move to the sitting room immediately. He stayed at the table, refilling his wine glass with the deliberate attention of a man who needed something to do with his hands, and he said, without looking at me, "I think you should get Nora somewhere warm tonight, Anna." That was all. He said it quietly and walked out before I could respond, and I filed that too, the warning in it, the shape of what he wasn't saying, the fact that he had said anything at all. I sent Nora to our house with the door code and told her to order anything she wanted and that I was going to be an hour behind her. Then I went through the sitting room, said my goodbyes with the mechanical pleasantness of a woman running on emergency protocol, collected my husband with my eyes and a tilt of my head that meant now, and got us both out of that house. The drive home was 20 minutes of Tate explaining. He used words like complicated and sensitive and information that came to light, and the family felt it was best, and I listened to every syllable, and none of it told me what I actually needed to know, which was who had said what to whom, and when, and why my daughter was the target. Tate was a man who had spent his whole life inside a story that Constance had written for him, and he was very good at delivering her lines in his own voice. When he stopped talking, I said, "What is the information that came to light?" And he said, "Mom will explain everything in time." And I said, "Tate, if you do not tell me what is being said about my daughter, I am going to find out on my own, and that is going to go considerably worse for everyone involved." He said, "Anna, please just trust the process." And I thought, there it is, the corporate language of a man who has outsourced his conscience. Nora was on the couch when we got home. She'd changed into sweats and ordered Thai food and was watching television with the focused blankness of someone who is using a screen as a wall between themselves and what they're feeling. I sat with her. Tate went upstairs. I didn't ask him to stay, and he didn't offer. Nora and I sat there until midnight, and she told me what little she knew, which was nothing. She had no idea what she was supposed to have done, no idea what the family decision was based on, nothing but the memory of Constance's eyes on her across that dinner table, and the walk through the foyer with Everett, who had not looked at her once. "Mom," Nora said at about 11:30, "do you think Grandma Constance ever actually liked me?" And I said, "I think she found you inconvenient, and I think that tells you more about her than it does about you." Nora looked at me for a moment and then said, "You're about to go absolutely feral on this family, aren't you?" And I said, "I am going to be extremely methodical and extremely effective." And she almost smiled, and that almost smile held me together for the next 6 hours. At 7:19 the following morning, Bart Gallagher called my cell phone. He never called my cell phone. He had called Tate's cell phone for 12 years. He called mine. "Anna." His voice was tight in the specific way of a man who has not slept and has been arguing with himself since approximately 2 a.m. "I need to see you today. Not Tate, you. And I need you to know before we meet, I am telling you something today that is going to be the most important conversation of your life. And the reason I'm telling you is because what happened last night was wrong, and what is being planned next is worse. And I have spent 30 years being the Beaumont family's attorney, and I am not willing to be the instrument of what comes next." He breathed. There is something about Nora. Something Constance knows, and it is not what Constance thinks it is. And the difference between those two things is the difference between your daughter's future and... He stopped. "Just meet me, please." I said, 9 o'clock, the coffee place on Westheimer, not your office. He said, "Yes, thank you." And I could hear in his voice the exhausted relief of a man who had finally decided to do the right thing. and was terrified of what it was going to cost him. I sat with the phone in my hand, and I thought about Constance's words at that dinner table. There are things in this family you haven't been told. And I understood, with the precise and terrible clarity of a structure revealing its own flaw, that the secret I was about to learn had been in this family long before Thanksgiving, long before my marriage, possibly longer than I could imagine. And it changed everything about why Nora was in that car. My daughter spent Thanksgiving night alone in her car outside the house of the woman who was supposed to love her. And the reason why, the real reason, the one buried under 12 years of Beaumont performance and propriety, was about to walk into a coffee shop on Westheimer and sit across from me and detonate like something that had been waiting a very long time to go off. I got to the coffee shop on Westheimer 12 minutes early because I needed to be there first. I needed the table with my back to the wall and a clear view of the door, and I needed the 4 minutes alone to get my face under control before Bart Gallagher walked in with whatever he was carrying. I ordered black coffee, and I sat, and I breathed, and I thought about Nora asleep upstairs in her childhood bedroom, and I thought about the note in Tate's coat pocket. The timing must be before the holiday, permanent, no room for appeal. And I thought about Constance's face at that table, and I tried to build the architecture of what I was about to learn before I had to learn it out loud. Bart arrived at exactly 9. He was a trim, silver-haired man in his early 60s who had the bearing of someone who had spent a career presenting difficult information to powerful people, and who now, walking toward my table in a coffee shop on a Friday morning, looked like someone had taken all of that bearing and put it through a wash cycle. He sat down, he ordered nothing, he put his hands flat on the table between us, and he said, "What I'm about to tell you cannot go back to Constance through any channel that can be traced to me until you have had time to act on it. Do you understand?" I said, "Yes." He nodded. He said, "Nora is not the reason Constance did what she did last night. Nora is the excuse. The reason is money, and the money goes back a long way." That was the sentence that cracked everything open. Not an affair, not a grudge. Money. Old, deliberate, patient money, and a secret that had been locked inside the Beaumont family trust for 19 years. Here is what Bart told me in the careful, sequential way of a man who had clearly rehearsed the order because the order mattered. When Tate and I married 12 years ago, Constance had added a provision to the Beaumont Family Trust, quietly, using a secondary filing that did not require Tate's signature, only hers as the trust's primary administrator. The provision stated that any grandchildren of Constance Beaumont who were determined through documentation she deemed credible to fall outside the direct Beaumont bloodline would be automatically excluded from the trust's distribution. Constance had never told Tate about this provision. She had never told anyone except Bart, who had drafted it under attorney-client privilege and had spent 12 years carrying it like a stone. 3 months ago, Constance had received, and this is where my coffee went cold in my hands, an anonymous letter. The letter claimed that Nora was not Tate's biological daughter. The letter included what it claimed was a DNA analysis. The letter named a man. The man's name was Perry Odom, a sculptor I had met in my final year of graduate school at UT Austin, whom I had dated briefly before I met Tate, whom I had not spoken to in over 13 years. I set my coffee cup down. I said, "Nora is Tate's daughter." Bart said, "I know." I said, "What do you mean, you know?" And Bart said, "Because the DNA analysis in that letter is fraudulent. I had it examined by an independent lab before I agreed to be in that house last night, and it is not a legitimate analysis. It was generated using template software that has been used in at least 3 other fraudulent paternity disputes in Texas in the past 2 years. Anna, Someone sent Constance a fake DNA report, and Constance, because she wanted to believe it, did not verify it. She acted on it. She restructured the trust exclusion to activate against Nora specifically, and she planned what happened at that dinner table as the opening move of a legal process to formally remove Nora from the family inheritance. I sat very still. Who sent the letter? Bart looked at the table. I said his name again. Bart, who sent the letter? And he said, I believe it was Priya. Priya, Everett's wife. The woman who had been sitting at that Thanksgiving table making sympathetic eye contact with me while her mother-in-law exiled my daughter on the basis of a document Priya had apparently manufactured. The motive, when Bart laid it out, was so clean and so cold that I almost admired it. The Beaumont Family Trust was set to distribute a significant portion of its holdings to the grandchildren's generation when Constance turned 75, 2 years from now. Everett and Priya had 2 sons. Tate and I had 1 daughter. With Nora removed from the distribution, Everett's line received a substantially larger share. Priya, who had spent 12 years watching Everett defer to Tate in the family hierarchy, who had spent 12 years smiling the pleasant smile of a woman waiting for the math to change in her favor, had found a way to change the math without changing the family structure at all. She had sent an anonymous letter with a fabricated document to a woman she knew would want to believe it, and she had let Constance's own biases and her own trust provision do the rest. She hadn't needed to say a word at that dinner table. She had just needed to light the match 3 months ago and wait. Everett, I said. Does he know? Bart said, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And I believed him because the uncertainty in his voice was real. Everett walking Nora out, was that the performance of a man complicit in his wife's scheme, or a man who had been told a story by his wife and believed it? I didn't know yet, but I was going to find out. I asked Bart what he needed from me. He said, I need you to know that I will testify to the trust provision and its activation if this goes to litigation. I will provide the fraudulent DNA analysis and the independent lab results that refute it. I am not willing to protect this family at the cost of Nora's rights or yours or the truth. He looked like he meant every word, the way people look when they have made a decision that is going to hurt them, and they have made it anyway. What you do next is up to you, Anna, but do it fast. Constance has already consulted with a litigation attorney about formalizing the trust exclusion. You have maybe 2 weeks before that process moves forward. I left the coffee shop. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 7 minutes. Then I called my own attorney, not a family lawyer, not anyone connected to the Beaumont orbit, but a woman named Claudette Reese, who had been my college roommate at UT Austin, and who now ran one of the most respected estate litigation practices in Houston. I said, Claudette, I need everything you have for the next 3 weeks. She said, tell me what happened. I told her. When she finished, she said, oh, they messed with the wrong one, and started talking strategy. And I drove home feeling, for the first time since Constance set down her champagne glass, like the ground under my feet was mine. What came next was not loud. The best revenge never is. It is quiet and thorough, and it arrives wearing the same professional clothing that the people who wronged you thought was their exclusive uniform. Claudette filed for emergency injunctive relief to freeze the trust amendment process within 48 hours. She had Bart's documentation, the fraudulent DNA analysis, the independent lab refutation, and 12 years of Beaumont financial records that I had legal access to as Tate's spouse and as a secondary signatory on several of the family's charitable accounts. What those records showed, and this was the part that Claudette described as the gift that keeps on giving, was that over the previous 3 years, Priya had been corresponding with the Trust's administrative office using an email address that closely mimicked Constance's personal assistant Blythe's account. Not Constance's account, Blythe's. The Mimic account had been used to make several inquiries about the trust's grandchildren exclusion provision, inquiries that mapped directly to the timeline of Priya building her plan. She had been researching the mechanism for over 2 years before she sent that letter. This was not impulse. This was architecture. And I know architecture. Claudette brought in a digital forensics firm. The forensic trail from the Mimic email account to a device registered in Priya and Everett's Dallas home took 9 days to establish and was, according to the lead investigator, one of the cleaner paper trails she had seen in a domestic financial fraud case, because Priya had been careful but not quite careful enough. She had accessed the Mimic account 3 times from her own home network without using a VPN, and internet service provider records do not lie. We had her. Clean, documented, defensible in court. I did not call Constance. I did not call Tate. I did not send a single warning shot. I let the legal process walk up to the Beaumont estate door and knock. The petition was served on a Tuesday morning. Constance received it at 10 a.m. and called Tate, who called me, and I let it go to voicemail. Tate came home at noon, and for the first time in our marriage, he looked genuinely shaken, not performed shaken, not the management of an uncomfortable situation, but actually destabilized, the way people look when the story they've been living in has been revised without their permission. He said, "Anna, what is this?" I said, "This is me protecting our daughter, which is something you declined to do at your mother's dinner table." He said, "I didn't know." And I said, "You didn't ask," which is a choice, Tate. A choice is not the same as not knowing. He sat down in the kitchen chair and he put his face in his hands, and I watched him and I felt something that was not cruelty and not satisfaction, but something adjacent to both. The specific feeling of a woman who has stopped waiting for someone else to do the thing and has done it herself. Priya, through her Dallas attorney, initially denied everything. That lasted 4 days until the forensic report was filed, and her attorney apparently had a very clear conversation with her about the difference between a defensible position and an indefensible one. On the 5th day, Priya's attorney contacted Claudette to discuss settlement terms. I told Claudette there was one term. Nora's position in the Beaumont Family Trust would be fully restored, in writing, with a legal amendment that could not be unilaterally altered by Constance or any single trustee. And Priya would provide a signed affidavit acknowledging that the DNA analysis she sent was fraudulent and that Nora's biological parentage had never been legitimately in question. No negotiation. Those terms and no others. Priya signed in the 3rd week of December. I heard from Claudette that she cried during the signing, and I had exactly 0 feelings about that. But Constance, I need to tell you about Constance, because Priya was the architect of the plan, but Constance was the one who sat at that table and looked my daughter in the eyes and told her she was no longer family. And that required its own reckoning. I requested a meeting with Constance, directly, no attorneys. She agreed, because Constance Beaumont had never in her life declined a direct confrontation, and I think some part of her respected that I had asked for one. We met at her estate on a Thursday afternoon in mid-December, in the formal sitting room with the antique furniture and the family photographs and the portrait of Constance's late husband, Redmond, that watched every conversation in that room with oil-painted gravitas. I wore one of my work suits, charcoal, fitted, professional, because I wanted to meet her on her terms, and I wanted her to see that I had never actually been intimidated by her terms. I had just been choosing my battles. I told her everything. I told her about Priya's Mimic email account. I told her about the fraudulent DNA analysis and the independent lab. I told her about the 2 years of research Priya had done into the trust's exclusion provision before sending that letter. I told her that the plan had been designed specifically to exploit her tendency to act on information she wanted to believe, her long-standing ambivalence about me, and her trust provision as a weapon pointed at my daughter. I spoke for 11 minutes. Constance did not interrupt me once. When I finished, the sitting room was very quiet. Constance sat with her hands folded in her map, and she looked at the middle distance for a long time, and I watched 73 years of absolute certainty move through something difficult. Then she said, "I should have verified the report." I said, "Yes." She said, "I should have spoken to you directly before taking any action." I said, "Yes, you should have. And more than that, Constance, even if everything in that letter had been true, what you did to Nora at that table was not justice. It was theater, and the audience was a 19-year-old girl who had never done anything to you except exist in a way that you found inconvenient." Constance flinched. A small movement, barely visible, but I had spent 12 years learning to read her, and I saw it. "She sat in her car for 2 hours," I said, "on Thanksgiving, while you finished your coffee." Constance looked at her hands. She said very quietly, "I know." She asked to see Nora, and what my daughter did next is the part of this story I am most proud of, not because of what she said, but because of how completely she did it on her own terms. Nora agreed to meet Constance. She chose the location, a coffee shop near Rice University, her territory, her turf. She wore jeans and her favorite worn-in hoodie, and she ordered the most elaborate drink on the menu because she said it was fun to watch people adjust their expectations. I waited in the car. They were inside for 55 minutes. When Nora came out, she got in the passenger seat and was quiet for a moment, and then she said she apologized. Like an actual apology, not a Beaumont non-apology. She cried. I said, "Did you believe it?" Nora thought about it carefully, the way she thinks about things that matter. "I believed that she was sorry," she said. "I'm not sure she fully understands what she did, but I believed that she was sorry for the outcome. I told her I needed time. I told her that we all decided was a choice she made, and that she doesn't get to take it back by explaining it was based on wrong information. The action was what it was." I said, "That is exactly right." Nora said, "And I told her that if she ever wants a relationship with me going forward, it has to be one she earns, one conversation at a time. No more," and I said this exact word, "no more cashmere wrap diplomacy." I laughed for the first time in 3 weeks. A real laugh, the kind that moves through your whole chest. Nora grinned at me and said, "Too much?" And I said, "Absolutely not enough." Tate and I separated in January. Quietly, legally, with attorneys who communicated so that we rarely had to. He moved into a serviced apartment in the Galleria area, and we began the process of uncoupling 12 years of shared life with the careful, respectful efficiency of two people who have stopped being in love but have a daughter they both love more than they resent each other. I will not pretend the separation was painless. 12 years of a life with someone, even a life that turned out to have gaps in it, that doesn't end without grief. I grieved it. I let myself grieve it on specific evenings with specific wine and did not let it bleed into the hours I needed to be functional. What I had told Tate in the kitchen was true. He had made a choice at that dinner table. Not an evil choice. I don't think Tate is an evil person. But a coward's choice, the choice of a man who had never learned to put anything above Constance's approval, and that was a limitation I could no longer build my life around. He was a decent father to Nora. He called her twice a week and took her to lunch on Sundays and told her, in February, that he was sorry for what had happened at Thanksgiving. Nora told me he cried. She said, "I told him I forgave him, but that forgiveness doesn't mean I forget that he sat there." I thought, this kid is going to change the world. Everett, as it turned out, had not known the full scope of Priya's plan. He had known about the DNA letter because Priya had told him about it, but she had presented it to him as something she had received anonymously and forwarded to Constance, not as something she had manufactured. When the forensic report surfaced, Everett's world tilted in a different direction than anyone had predicted. He called me directly in late December. He said, "Anna, I don't know how to say this except to say it. I am sorry, and I don't expect that to mean anything yet." I said, "It doesn't, but I appreciate the call."
He and Priya entered couples counseling in January, which is their business and their story to navigate. What I know is that the forensic report and the affidavit are public record, and the Beaumont family's social network in Houston is not a small or forgiving one, and Priya built her plan on the assumption that it would never be traced. She was wrong. The price of being wrong in this world is paid in the currency of reputation, and that price is still being paid. And here is the ending. Not a dramatic ending, not a courtroom or a confrontation or a public unmasking. A real ending, which is quieter and more permanent than any of those things. On the last Saturday of March, I picked Nora up from Rice and we drove to the Gulf. Not far, just down to Galveston, the way we used to when she was small, and we needed to remember what horizon looked like. We got coffee and walked on the sea wall and talked about everything and nothing, the way mothers and daughters talk when they are also friends.
When they have been through something together and have come out the other side still standing and still choosing each other. Nora was applying for a summer research fellowship at an urban planning nonprofit in Austin. She was thinking about law school after her undergrad, maybe. She was, in every observable way, fine. More than fine. The kind of fine that comes from having been through something hard and having discovered that you survived it. That you were, in fact, built for more than the room they tried to confine you to. I had relaunched my architecture firm under my maiden name, Voss Studio, in February. I had 3 new clients and a 4th in conversation, and I was working out of a leased office space in Montrose that had exposed brick and natural light, and no photographs of anyone's late husband watching me from the wall. I was 43 years old, and I was tired in some places and alive in others, and I was building something that was entirely my own, which is a feeling I had quietly given up on somewhere in the middle of my marriage and had quietly reclaimed somewhere in the middle of its ending. Mom, Nora said at some point, standing on the seawall with the Gulf wind doing whatever it wanted to her hair, "Do you think Grandma Constance is going to be okay?" I thought about it, honestly. I think she is going to spend the rest of her life figuring out the difference between power and love, I said, and I think that's going to be hard for her, but I think she might do it. Nora nodded slowly. "I'm going to have lunch with her next month," she said. "I decided." I said, "Okay." She said, "I'm not doing it for her. I'm doing it for me, because I want to be the person who gives people the chance to be better, even people who didn't give me the same chance." I looked at my daughter, 19 years old, Gulf wind in her hair, burnt orange and bone-deep stubborn, and twice as strong as anyone at that dinner table had given her credit for, and I thought, they tried to write her out of the story, and instead, she became the whole point of it. Here is what I know now that I didn't know on Thanksgiving. The most dangerous thing you can do to a woman is underestimate what she will do when you come for her child. The second most dangerous thing you can do is assume exile is permanent, because some people, when you send them out to sit alone in the cold, do not fall apart. They use the quiet to plan. And when they come back inside, and they will come back inside, they will have already rearranged every piece of furniture in the room. You just won't know it yet. Nora knew it. I raised her to know it. And every person who sat at that table and said nothing while my daughter walked out that door got to learn it, one document at a time, one filing at a time, in the careful, thorough, completely legal demolition of every plan they thought was airtight. Wealth is not armor, pedigree is not protection, and the truth, when you have the patience and the evidence and a daughter worth fighting for, the truth wins, every single time. Anna Loss, formerly Beaumont, architect, mother, the wrong woman to cross.